Hello, this is Josh Patel back again with another biology video. Today we're going to be doing chapter 22, which is plant growth, reproduction, and response. So we'll start at lesson 1, which is plant life cycles. Our key concept is all plants alternate between two phases in their life cycles. Plant life cycles alternate between producing spores and gametes. So a two-phase life cycle is called an alternation of generations. So we have the haploid phase, and then we have the diploid phase, and then it alternates between the two. So here we have the two phases, and we don't need to know anything about them, so well, we'll go over anyway. First, we have the sporophyte phase, so we start with a zygote, which is basically a one cell. It's in humans, it's like when you're, it's right before, it's before you're born. It's when you're still going through the uterus and everything. You're still like a bunch of little cells. So then it turns into the sporophyte, and then it goes into meiosis to get spores, and then we get the gametophyte, and then we eventually get gametes, which are the sex cells, and then they fertilize to become zygotes again. So the spore-producing plant is the mature sporophyte. Sporophyte phase is diploid, begins with fertilized eggs. Spores produced through meiosis. The gamete-producing plant is the mature gametophyte, and gametophyte phase is haploid, begins with spores. So if we remember, diploid is when we have like the two strands of DNA, haploid is when we have half of that, and we usually think of haploid with sex cells. So it begins with spores, gametes produced through mitosis. Life cycle phase looks different among various plant groups. So non-vascular plants have a dominant genotype phase. Moss gametophytes look like green carpet. Moss sporophytes shoot up as stalk-like structures. And this is just too in-depth, and we don't need to know this for Intro to Biology or Biology 1. The sporophyte is the dominant phase for seedless vascular plants. Fern spores form in sacs sorry on undesirable of mature sporophyte fronds. A fern gametophyte or polyphus produces sperm and eggs. It's like that from the forms on the prothallus, growing into a sporophyte. So the sporophyte is the dominant phase for seed plants. Pine trees are typically seed plants. Sporophyte. Female spores produce in female cones. Male spores produce in male cones. Male spores develop through pollen grains, the male gametophyte. Female spores develop in female gametophytes that produce eggs. Sperm from pollen travels down the pollen tube towards the egg. Fertilization, egg develops into an embryo. So this is basically showing how a plant gets impregnated and produces fruit and or passes on their seeds. Ovule develops into protective pine seeds. So the sporophyte is the dominant phase for seed plants. So a fertilized egg grows into an embryo while the ovule develops into a pine seed. So we got a seed which produces a tree, and the cones produced in the female cone, and pollen here is produced in the male cone. And this either goes through meiosis or, well, they both go through meiosis. So the female spores are produced through meiosis. And we got an ovule. So female scale, female spores develop into female gametophytes, which produce eggs in the ovules. While the male cone, the male spores are produced through meiosis. We get pollen grains, and male spores develop into male gametophytes called pollen grains. So the male cones go through meiosis and become pollen. Females one go through meiosis and become ovule. When pollen grain reaches the end of a female scale, a pollen tube grows. Sperm travels through this tube towards the egg. So basically fertilization happens when the ovule reaches the pollen. 22.2 is reproduction in flower plants. Reproduction of flowering plants takes place with flowers. Flowers contain reproductive organs protected by specialized leaves. Sepals and petals are modified leaves. Sepals are outermost layer that protect developing flowers. So the sepal is usually the part of it's usually greenish, and it's the part under the flower. So if you think of a rose, you know the green part under the flower. So petals can help to attract animal pollinators. So colored petals help attract animals because they're look nice and pretty and they like stand out. A stamen is the male structure of the flower. So we have female and male part of the flower, and the stamen is the male part. And the stamen has filament and an anther. And this picture is pretty blurry here, so I'll explain it. The filament is the green lines going upwards, so like the branches, I guess. And then the anther are the little red things on top, which are full with pollen, and we have to remember which one's which. So we have the stamen, which is the male part, which includes the filament and the anther. And anther produces pollen grains. Filament supports the anther. The innermost layer of a flower is the female carpel. So, carpel, we have the stigma, style, and ovary. Sometimes they call this the pistil too, so like the stamen and the pistil. Stamen would be the male part and pistil would be the female part, but here they're calling it carpel. So we have the stigma, which is the very top, which is basically the entrance. And then the style is the tube that extends the stigma up there, or it's basically the whole tube, so the inside. And the ovaries all the way at the bottom. So pollen comes in through the stigma, goes down the style into the ovary. And yet again, all these three structures are called the carpel, but they're also called the pistil, and I heard pistil more frequently than carpel. So stigma is sticky tip, style is tube leading from stigma to ovary. Ovary produces female gametophytes. And yeah, so the stigma is a sticky thing that basically when pollen touches it, it gets stuck to it and it goes down. Flowering plants can be pollinated by wind or animals. Flowering plants pollinate when pollen grains land on the stigma. Wind-pollinated flowers have small flowers and large amounts of pollen. Animal pollinated flowers have large flowers and less pollen. Many flowering plants pollinate by animal pollinators. You don't need to know the difference between wind plants and animal pollinating plants, but just know that animals and wind can both pollinate plants. Pollination occurs as animals feed from flower to flower. Animals pollinate more effective than wind pollination. So the animals take pollen from one, like the pollen gets stuck to the animal. So if you see here, like the hands of this bee have pollen stuck to them, and then they travel to another flower, and when they're near the style or the stigma, the pollen gets stuck to and it goes down. Fertilization takes place within the flower. Male gametophytes or pollen grains are produced in the anther. Male spores produced in anther by meiosis. Each spore divides by meiosis to form two haploid cells, two cells from a single pollen grain. And that's not that important. One female gametophyte can form in each ovule of a flower's ovary. So 4 female spores produced in ovaries by meiosis. One spore develops into a female gametophyte. Female gametophytes contains 7 cells. One cell has 2 nuclei or polar nuclei. One cell develops into an egg, and that is not that important. Basically, we just need to know the parts of the flower and how it reproduces by pollination. Pollination occurs when a pollen grain lands on the stigma. One cell from pollen grain forms pollen tubes, and other cells from 2 sperm that travel down the tube. Flowering plants go through the process of double fertilization. So here we have ovule, and this is the female gametophyte, and as we see here, we have a cell that has polar nuclei, as it said before, and then there's 2 sperms and an egg, and this isn't that important. You're probably never going to see a picture like this again. Flowering plants go through the process of double fertilization. One sperm fertilizes the egg, while other sperm utilizes with polar nuclei forming endosperm. Endosperm provides food supply for the embryo. So the endosperm basically provides and feeds for the embryo. So each ovule becomes a seed. The surrounding ovary grows into a fruit. So pollination has to occur for a fruit to form. 22.3 Seed dispersal and germination. Seed disperse and begin to grow when conditions are favorable. Animals, wind, and water can spread seeds. Seeds dispersed by animals can have nutritious fruits or fruits that cling. So if it's a fruit plant, the seeds are probably going to be dispersed by animals because the animals eat the fruit and then carry it to a different spot. Seeds dispersed by wind can have wing or parachute-like fruits. So here we have this, and here, if you've ever seen these, they're on trees a lot, and they'll fall and they'll fly around. These are dandelions, I forgot the name. Seeds dispersed by wind, by water, have fruit that float. Seeds begin to grow when environment conditions are favorable. Seed dormancy is a state in which the embryo has stopped growing. So there are certain plants that have dormant seeds, which mean that they don't grow right away. They grow at certain parts of the year when certain conditions have been met, and it's just another way to help them survive. Dormancy may end when conditions are favorable, while dormant embryos can withstand extreme conditions. Germination begins the growth of an embryo into a seedling. Water causes seeds to swell and crack coats. Embryonic roots radical is first to umbrage. Water activates enzymes that help send sugar to embryo. Embryonic shoots plumage extremes and emerges next. Leaves emerge last, and this is another non-important slide. Once photosynthesis begins, the plant is called a seedling. So 22.4 Asexual reproduction. Plants can produce genetic clones of themselves through asexual reproduction. Plants can reproduce asexually with stems, leaves, or roots. Asexual reproduction allows a plant to make copies of itself. Regeneration is one type of asexual reproduction. Plants grow a new individual from fragments of parents. Occurs when a piece of a stem, leaf, or root falls off the parent plant. So, vegetative reproduction is another type of asexual reproduction. Stem, leaves, or roots attached to parent plant produce new individuals. Specific adaptations include stolons, rhizomes, and tubers. So humans can produce plants with desirable traits using vegetative structures. Vegetative propagation takes advantage of plants' ability to reproduce asexually. Humans use one plant with desirable traits to produce many individuals. Cutting off leaves or stem may grow new roots. So they basically take one plant, and if it's doing really well, they make this plant reproduce even more by replanting its stems. So grafting joins the parts of two plants together form a hybrid plant. So basically you can take like a branch of an orange tree and a branch of an apple, or attach it to an apple tree, and it'll eventually fuse together and grow, and you can basically have two plants on one fruit, two fruits on one plant. 22.5 Plant hormones and responses. Plant hormones guide plant growth and development. Plant hormones regulate plant functions. Hormones are chemical messages. So hormones are in any living thing, and it's basically these chemical messages that tell our body to do specific things when they appear. Produced in one part of an organism stimulates or suppresses activity in another part. Gibberellins are plant hormones that produce dramatic increase in size. Ending seed dormancy. Rapid growth of young seedlings. Rapid growth of some flower stalks. So there are these certain plants here. There's a lot in Florida we see. And they grow these big stalks, these big giant stems that go up, and they just produce seeds up there, and they basically just disperse. So they're basically saying that hormones at a certain time of the plant's life tells the plant to grow this thing, so that's what it does. So ethylene causes the ripening of fruits, and we don't need to know any of these specific hormones. So some fruits picked before they are ripened, sprayed with ethylene to ripen when reached the destination. So basically humans can ripen fruits using this hormone. And then we have cytokinase, which stimulates cytokinesis. So final stage of cell division, as we know, cytokinesis, like telekinesis, produces and grows roots, seeds, and fruits, involved in growing of side branches. So then we have auxins, lengthen plant cells in growing tip. So stimulates growth of primary stem, controls some forms of tropism. A tropism is the movement of plant in response to an environmental stimulus. Plants can respond to light, touch, gravity, and seasonal changes. So phototropism is the tendency of a plant to grow towards light. So if you ever see a tree and it's leaned a certain way, it's probably because it's trying to find light, like that one. Since the window's here, the light comes through here, so it wants to get closer to the light. So auxins bend up on shade side of stem. Cells on shaded side lengthen, causes stem to bend towards the light. So we have another one, which is thigmotrophism, and this is a plant's response to touch-like stimulus. Climbing plants and vines, plants that grow in direction of constant wind. So we have gravitropism, which is a plant's response to Earth's gravitational pull. Positive gravitationalism is downward growing roots, and negative is growing upward, which would be growing shoots. Some plants have rapid response not involving growth. Some responses protect plants from predators. Some responses allow plants to capture food, so like the Venus flytrap. And then photoperiodism is a response to the changing length of day and night. So as we know, we have our days fluctuate. In the summer we have longer days, in the winter we have shorter days, so plants activate to these things. Triggers some plants to flower, triggers fall colors, winter dormancy of deciduous trees. So that's the end of chapter 22, which was all about plants. And so a lot of this stuff you didn't have to know, and a lot of it was very detail oriented. So just basically get the key concepts out of it.